March, we've got a workshop, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to split you into groups, and then we'll do the workshop, which is based around a fairly simple system, and we just want to get your ideas about how you would apply hazard to it. And then your group will go away and continue the study for a while and produce a brief report. Now you're actually assessed on the discussion that we'll have. The assessment's an oral discussion. We'll sit around the table and chat about your hazard, and you tell me what what you've done, and we'll discuss it and argue about it if necessary. And I'll give you a mark for it. And this will account for 20% of this module. So it's fairly easy to do, seriously. I mean, most people get a reasonably good mark for this, and get a very good mark, and it accounts for 20% of this module. So it's a worthwhile exercise. And most students who do it, and they've never come across hazard before, say, it was quite an interesting thing to do. Okay, so I've put is into groups, approximately 6 to a group. I think that group's got 5. So if you don't see your name up there, give me a shout. I downloaded these names off new contacts. Sometimes they're a little bit out of date. But that's the groups I'm going to put you in to do the hazard. This is on Blackboard if you want to double check and make sure. But you don't really need to know which group you're in until we do the workshop. We'll do the workshop in here. Okay. Right, so the aim of today's lecture, providing a basic grounding in the tools for carrying out the identification and nominal assessment of hazards. I say nominal because in a real hazard, the whole point of hazard is to identify hazards. I think I've made this point before. If you don't know that there's a hazard there, then you're unaware of it. The real trick is actually in identifying the hazard. Once you've identified a hazard, you can do something about it. And hazard is the sort of formal way of doing it. So identification and assessment. Identification, you use hazard to identify hazards, and it's a qualitative approach. It's based on judgment and experience and how well the people involved know the system. If it's a new system, you really do need experienced people there because they know what to look for. Hazard analysis, well, once you've identified your hazard, you'll want to assess it. We're not going to formally assess the hazards, but we'll just consider what they are and what we're going to do about it. In a real hazard, you might go on and do formal hazard analysis of things. So we're just going to talk about identification today, in particular just hazard. So there's some definitions. So you'll hear these words: hazard, risk, potential, likelihood. And one word I like to use: plausibility. How real is it? But there's some definitions of what I mean by hazard and risk. So hazard is a physical situation which has the potential to hurt someone, damage property, equipment, that sort of thing, which is usually worth a lot of money, damage the environment, which is very unpopular if you do damage the environment, or really any combination. So a hazard's got the potential to do any of these things here. So when we're talking about hazards, we're talking about the potential to actually hurt someone, hurt the property, or hurt the environment, or any 3 of them, any combination of them. And the risk is the likelihood that that will happen. Likelihood of a specified undesirable event occurring within a specified period or in certain circumstances. So the risk is usually given as a rate, once in 100 years, once in 1,000 years. That's the likelihood that a particular hazard will happen. Or sometimes it's given as a probability. So the probability that it might rain tomorrow could be 0.9. The probability that the temperature today will be 30 degrees Celsius would be 0. Yeah.
So can we underline undesirable as a keyword in risk? Undesirable. Or is it possible that it could also be the positive outcome?
Undesirable. Well, really undesirable would more apply to hazards. You can have undesirable hazards. Risk is just basically a qualitative factor. When you do hazard analysis, you should come out with a number which says the risk of this hazard happening is once a month, or once every 100 years, or once every 1,000 years. You start putting actual, so you're not really, once you get into analysis, you're really talking about actual quantitative factors, which have got numbers associated with them.
So we would say this undesirable is specific to the hazard because there are other events where you have a risk, but the outcome is positive.
Oh yeah. I mean, but usually in safety we're worried about the bad things happening, not the good things. you can't have a probability of winning the lottery, but I wouldn't call it a risk. It's something you'd like to do. So HAZOP traditionally, well, basically, when we go back to the days before HAZOP, people had to rely on things such as codes of practice, design codes, checklists. The designers had to sit down and really have a good think about their system. And okay, they managed to get some hazards, they couldn't get them all. That was the problem. And in the second half of the 20th century, a lot of plant, and I'm talking about process plant, but it could be any kind of plant, increased in complexity an awful lot. And once that complexity increased, people found it very hard to see if there was any hazards in the system. And it became almost impossible. And I mean, really, you really want to spot hazards during the design stage. Because if you can spot hazards during the design stage, it's as simple as rubbing a line out and drawing a new one in, because you can change your plant very quickly, very easily, and it doesn't cost you anything. Once you start building a plant, a pipeline or anything like that, you've invested millions of dollars into it, and if you then spot a hazard, it can be a very expensive exercise, because the rule is once you've spotted a hazard, you've got to do something about it. You can't ignore it, because you've spotted it. So HAZOPs were developed in the 1960s by ICI in the UK, and basically what they tried to do was they tried to address the complexity issues. They realised plant was getting built and it was getting more complicated, so they came up with a methodical, systematic method that they hoped would identify potential hazards and operability problems. So it's a method, it's an approach, it's a frame of mind. And it's called systematic because it goes through a lot of steps. And it covers, hopefully, all eventualities. And the idea is that it should identify all the hazards. Not perfect. It does depend on the expertise of the people doing it. But it is at least a successful approach. It's proven successful, and a lot of people now use this method. So, first step is to identify hazards and hazardous situations, of course. Now, some things are obvious, and appropriate action can be taken. So, just in everyday life or even in industry, can anybody suggest any hazards that they're aware of? Obvious ones.
Crossing the road, slips.
Crossing the road, yes. Why is that hazardous?
A vehicle could approach you from nowhere.
Yeah, you get hit by a car or a bus or something, so what would you do about it?
Would ensure.
Yeah, go to a proper crossing, yeah? Or just look. Yeah, well, I drive a car, and quite often people cross the road and they don't even look, you know, they're busy on their telephone, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's obvious things like that. Can anybody think of any industrial hazards that they've come across?
Slips, falls, slip, trips.
Slips and trips, yeah, they're hazards. What can you do about them?
Signages.
Signs, barriers.
Make sure somebody's going to clean the floor on a regular basis, so if somebody has a spill, it's not there for long. Yeah, exactly. That's good, yeah. So they're all hazards, which you can walk around anywhere and you can see things and say that's a hazard. So there's a pressure vessel. It's big. Not only big, it's huge. And it's got a lot of gas, let's say propane, 40 tonne of propane in there. And it's sitting in the corner of your plant, just sitting there doing not much. And you spot any hazards associated with that?
High pressure.
Well, it's under pressure, yes. But what do you mean by high pressure?
It might fail.
Low pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a low pressure?
So if the pressure was to rise in there, what would the hazard be?
Bursting.
It would burst.
Yeah.
You're not wrong with explosion, but first it would burst.
Burst.
So what would...
If you don't have relief valves.
Yeah, that's exactly it, yes. It's the one thing I actually photoshopped the relief valve off this one on purpose. It's extremely rare to see a large pressure vessel like that without a pressure relief valve in it. Anybody think of any other hazards?
No protection from third-party damage.
You what?
No protection from third-party damage.
Third-party damage, yeah. Well, it would depend where it was. I mean, if you had it by a roadside, for example, yeah, people could actually...
If I'm not wrong, there should be like insulations, no? For the kids.
Insulation, yeah.
Loss of containment.
Why would you get loss of containment?
Something is gas.
Yeah. You've got to think of the reason why you would get loss of containment. I mean, that is a pressure vessel, so it's probably built to a pretty good standard. So, you know, you don't design the pressure vessel to fail. I'm not saying it can't fail, but you design it so that it's pretty robust. You would design it to a standard, pressure vessel standard. What about if there was a fire underneath there? Suppose somebody spilled some oil down there and it caught fire. Hey? I can't quite hear you.
You cannot see it as a fusible disc or not,
Feasible disc?
fusible disc.
Yeah, I don't know what a fusible disc is.
Just a burns out, it's not.
Or a bursting disc? Oh, right, yeah. Gosh, that would be quite unusual on a pressure vessel, I think, bursting disc. You might have it in conjunction with a pressure relief valve.
Drains should be somewhere in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could actually have a bung round there, so it would prevent anything from getting underneath there, but also if you had a problem, it would also contain it. So yeah, you get the idea anyway. The whole point is that there are hazards which are obvious, but there's an awful lot of hazards in the design of a plant which are not so obvious. We have an example that we showed you undergraduates. It's probably a long time ago now, even for you lot. 1974, there was a plant in Flixborough producing nylon, and they had a massive leak of hexacycline, and the whole plant caught fire, blew up. It was a major event. They didn't used to do HAZOPs then. And the idea was, in them days, you built a plant and ran it until you had an incident, investigated the incident, and then put a few safety rules around it. So you basically let the incident happen. That's how you identified it. So we don't do that now. That used to be called learning from experience. So really what we're trying to do now, and it's quite endemic in industry now, is to use HAZOP. So there's just an example of how HAZOP sits alongside various other types of identification methods. There's your hazards in the middle. So the methods for identifying hazards, we talked about them, obvious, things that are obvious that we just talked about. The old way of doing it in industry, which we don't do anymore, which was wait and see what happens. We'll run the plant, and if there's an accident, we kill a few people, we'll patch it up. Checklists, yeah, checklists are fine, but they can go out of date. And HAZOPs. So this is a qualitative method. So it counts on the experience of the engineers involved. And of course, the other end of that, once you've identified the hazards, you can then analyse them, which you'll be doing with the other lecturers on this module. And that's quantitative. And that's where your risk values, your quantitative risk values and things like that. So HAZOP's concerned with the process rather than the process units. And it takes an ideal process, working as the designer intends it to, and gives it a little deviation. You deviate it from its normal operating method. And then you have a look at it and you say, well, okay, what's going to happen if you do deviate it? So it investigates causes, effects, and consequences of the hazard. And I've got a note at the bottom there saying it corresponds to hazard stage 3. That's actually something we get from the CME. And basically, hazard stage 3, if you take a project life cycle where you've got the conceptual design at the very start, so you're on the back of an envelope basically, you can actually do basic hazards. You can have a check for basic hazards when you're first conceptualizing your system. Once you start designing the system, you can do initial hazard identification, because you then know what the fluids are going to be and what the equipment's going to be and things like that. Once you get to a detailed engineering point, so you've actually got detailed engineering information about the plant you're going to build, then you can do a HAZOP. HAZOP depends on that stage. It's ready to be built. You're going to start building it tomorrow. You've got all the designs, all the machinery, you know everything, all the control equipment and everything like that. That is when you do a HAZOP on a new system. You also do HAZOP on old systems as well, but that's when you do it on a new system. Because after that, you start building it, and like I say, once you start building a plant, if you identify hazards, it gets very, very expensive to fix them. So HAZOPs are structured, critical examinations of plant. Like I say, it's normally undertaken by a team of experienced engineers, and the HAZOP method is thorough. It's designed to be as thorough as possible because it's methodical because it attempts to identify all the possible deviations from the intended design. So how does it do this? Well, it does this by taking part of the plant that's working as intended. One of the things about HAZOP is you can't do a HAZOP on an entire plant. What you've got to do is you've got to divide it up into discrete sections, and then you do your HAZOP on that discrete section. Once you're finished, you then move on to the next one. So we'll take a part of a plant working as intended, then we'll deviate one of its parameters. And that's what happens. If anything, sometimes nothing happens. So there's a plant working, and there's a parameter, could be pressure, temperature, flow rate, that kind of thing. And it's toggling along quite happily. And what we do, you apply a parameter deviation, so we'll reduce the flow rate, or we'll reduce the temperature in that part of the plant. And then, so therefore the plant's not working properly, and we then sit round the table and discuss, is this a problem? What's going to happen? What's going to be a consequence of this? And sometimes it's nothing. It doesn't matter. That's fine. But sometimes it is. It's a big deal. And it could cause an explosion, it could cause a pressure vessel to rupture, that kind of thing. In which case, you've identified a possible hazard. So the deviations are generated by very rigorous questioning. That's the strength of HAZOP. It forces you to go through all possible deviations, if you like. And to do this, you use guide words. And the guide words, there's some examples of guide words. No or none, more of, less of, part of, as well as. And there's a whole series of these. Now, depends on the plant that you're doing your HAZOP on. Some of these keywords, some of these guide words will be relevant, sometimes they'll not be. It's up to you to decide what's relevant and what's not relevant. So no, none is none of the design intent is achieved. Whatever that might be, you might have no flow, no level in the tank. More of, well, you've got an increase in a particular parameter, so the temperatures, you've got more temperature than you anticipated, more pressure, less of, and so on and so forth. Now the guide words are then added to the parameters in the system. So when you look at the small system that you're doing the HAZOP on, you need to understand the different parameters that's involved. So you've got things like flow rate, pressure, temperature, And there's various other things. Like I said, it depends on the plant you're doing it on. So you add a guide word to a parameter, and you do all combinations of this. So you add a guide word to a parameter, that gives you a deviation. And parameters, obviously, things like that. So how does that work? So it gets more of temperature. So there's a guide word and there's a parameter. So if you add them two together, you get more temperature, or an increase in temperature. It's really simple. No or none plus flow means we normally have a flow rate in this part of the system, but now we've got no flow rate. Less of pressure, we've got a decrease in pressure, so on and so forth. So you say to yourself, the plant is working normally the way the designer intends it to, and then we're going to apply this deviation. And then it's a more complete list of guide words which you can apply. Now sometimes they don't logically add together. For example, you can say none for flow, but you couldn't really say none for temperature, because there's no such thing as no temperature, is there? Or no pressure. So you could have none for flow, but temperature and pressure would be higher and lower. Level, we had a level in a tank, that could be higher, lower, or it could even be none, because you could have no level at all in the tank. So when you're adding guide words to parameters, you've got to use a bit of common sense. It's got to make sense. If it doesn't make sense, just don't include it. So once we've got that, once we've got these deviations, we then look at them, and we need to examine the consequences of what they're going to do. And this is where the undesirable effects come in, I suppose. So we need to consider the cause. How could we've got a deviation there. We need to realise, can it happen? And we think of a plausible cause for that deviation, because sometimes you can't. If you can't think of a plausible cause for it, then it's not going to happen. So you need to think of a cause. So the effect is the deviation itself. Let's say no flow, for example. So we've got a viable cause for no flow. We then ask the consequence. What's going to happen because of this? What will happen as a result of this? Is it hazardous? Now, sometimes when you do that, the consequence might be a little bit of water goes down a drain. And you say, well, that's the consequence. Am I worried about it? No, it's only a bit of water going down a drain. However, the consequence could obviously be far more serious. It could be that the pressure vessel overpressures and ruptures, or the pipe overpressures and ruptures, or something like that. There's various other things that could happen. So if they're inconsequential, let's stop them. But if they are hazardous, so we're really asking, we're looking at the consequences and saying, are we worried about this? No, that's what's important. Now, if it is something that we are worried about, like pipeline bursts or something like that, then we've identified a hazard. We've actually identified a hazard that the designer missed. So we then need to do this one, the final one, the action. What can we do about it? Because once you've identified a hazard, you need to put something in place to address the hazard. Because if you don't, then you're knowingly letting that plant go ahead with a known hazard. And that wouldn't look good. Wouldn't be very safe. Now, we talk about cause, effect, and consequences, and, of course, actions. But people get confused with them. And when we're doing HAZOP, a lot of people are thinking of causes, but they're thinking of consequences at the same time. And you've got to be very, very structured about this. You've got to say to yourself, you're very disciplined, and say to yourself, I am looking for causes for this effect, and they have to be as direct as possible. Once you've got that, you can then look at the consequences. Do not confuse them, because if you do, you'll end up all over the place. Like this contraption here. Anybody tell me what this contraption does? Just a bit of fun. It's a pencil sharpener. Did you not see that? Okay, it's a bit of fun. Rube Goldberg. You open the window, fly the kite, the string lifts a small door, I think that's the door there, allowing the moths to escape, eating the red flannel shirt. Shirt becomes less, the shirt, shoe steps on the switch, hits the electric iron, burns a hole in the pants, and the smoke enters the tree, smokes out the opossum, which then jumps into the basket, pulling the rope, lifting the cage, allowing the woodpecker to chew the wood from the pencil and therefore sharpen it. Okay? And if the woodpecker's not well, then there's a little knife there, there's an emergency standby. Okay, so the idea behind this is we've got causes and effects and consequences training all the way through here from start to finish, and the end result is we sharpen a pencil. When you're doing HAZOP, be very, very wary of how far you go back for a cause. The cause has to directly, the reason for the cause has to be directly for the actual deviation. Okay? And we'll get a bit of experience of that when we do the workshop, because people will confuse them. Be absolutely sure where you are when it comes to cause, effect, and consequence. That's all that's for. I've tried to write that down in a little bit more of a structured way. So we'll start in the middle with the guide word and the parameter. And one of the ones we'll use a lot is no flow, so it's there in the slides. And this is the effect, this is the deviation we're going to apply to a plant. We're going to say there's no flow. So once you've done that, you then have to go back here and say why. Is it possible to have no flow? Because sometimes it's not. Sometimes you can't think of a cause. That's fine. But you have to get to think about it first. But basically, if you can't think of a cause, then it becomes plausible. You could have no flow. So once you've got a plausible cause for no flow, you say to yourself, well, okay, then that can happen. And if it does happen, what will be the consequence? What's going to happen as a result of this? You're experienced engineer sitting around a table, you've thought of that, you then have to say to yourself, well, is it serious? Does it matter? And like I said, well, it's just a bit of water going down a drain. No, but if it is serious, then you have to come up with an action. You have to come up with an engineering solution to that problem. And that engineering solution will either stop this cause from happening, which would be great. If you could do that, you're cutting out the cause completely, or you can mitigate the effect. And quite often in engineering, we're pretty much happy just mitigating the effect. Ringing an alarm bell, letting somebody know there's a problem so that we go and fix it. Or pressure relief valve lifting. You haven't stopped the cause, but what you've done is you've mitigated the effect. You've released the pressure in the pressure vessel, something like that. So the HAZOP procedure is based on a structured group discussion, and they go through all those formal deviations for a small part of the plant, and then once that's complete they move on to the next one. And to do this they use a formal reporting template, and that's what we'll use during the workshop. So the formal template looks something like this. You put your guide words and deviations down here, so no flow. You then think up possible causes for it. It's fine. If you can think of a cause, you then think about the consequences, and you write in what you think the consequences are going to be. And you can also say it's a serious consequence or whatever. If it's a serious consequence, you'll need to put something in the action column. You need to say, okay, added this or took this away or whatever. Or you could say, consequence considered and it wasn't serious. We can live with it. And then you work your way down. More of, less of, part of, more than. And then something's other. Something else happening. Yes?
So some of these parameters, when you deviate, the consequences could be heavy in the production and the economics. So we consider that one strictly consider the safety consequences.
Yeah, it's a good question. When you're looking at the consequences, the first one you look at is safety. Absolutely. But remember, we're talking not only about hurting people. You can't have things that hurt people, but also you've got the equipment to look after, because often the equipment's very, very expensive, multi-million dollar. So you're looking after the equipment. So you've got safety of people, safety of equipment, and also the environment. So if something was to say, okay, we end up with, I don't know, 1,000 tons of oil going into a lake, for example, that would be a very exact damage to the environment, wouldn't it? So when you're thinking of consequences, yeah, it's in terms of safety for people, preserving the equipment, which crops up quite a lot, and also preserving the environment as well. So those are your three main objectives of consequences. Good question.
So you do not consider financial impact or financial consequences?
Now you put, I think, all the, you just listed, for example, you said HEC, yeah? So what's the risk there? You say that, and you go to the environment where...
Okay, I can give a very specific example.
Yeah, you're quite correct, actually, yes. If you're a commercial plant, you've got to make money, you're making something, so the whole purpose of the plant there is that you're making a profit. So if you find a risk that would if you find a hazard that would shut your plant down for 1 month, then you'd be very interested in that, because you wouldn't want to shut down for a month.
So you still include it in the consequence column, despite it not being a safety concern.
Yes.
Right?
Because I think that would also be in protecting the equipment. You're protecting the plant, if you like. And it's the reason why people put high-level alarms on things. It's exactly the same thing. Because you don't want a high level. You want, if you get a high level, it rings a bell, and that's something you know you've got a high level. Because if you didn't, the plant could, well, you could cause all kinds of problems. You could damage the environment, you could kill people, but you could also shut the plant down for a month while it's getting repaired. And the people who own the plant will not be pleased about that. So yes, all those factors are taken into account when considering the consequences.
So you said there won't be any column for the risk analysis, because as we highlighted all the risks, I mean all the risks.
Yeah,
so
no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, when you identify these things,
yeah, because this
you
financial
would
yeah.
potentially go further and do a hazard analysis on it to see, because you've identified a consequence, and the idea might be that consequence could happen once a week. But you don't know. It could happen once a month. It could happen once every 1,000 years. You might have to carry out further hazard analysis on it to find out how serious you should take it. For this exercise, we're sticking to just general conversation around the table, because if I tried to branch off into hazard analysis with this, it would take weeks and weeks and weeks to get through it. So we'll just keep it simple. But yeah, it's a good point, if you understand that once you get to this stage, you might have to go off, branch off. You might have another team working on hazard analysis, and the hazard team could pass this on to them and say, you know, we've got a potential consequence here. Please work out how often this is going to happen, and what, you know, what should we do something about it. That's fine. So we do this systematic examination for each part of the plant. So like I say, we don't haze up the whole plant, we just haze up a section of it. Draw a little section, and see we can do a haze up study on that. When that's complete, you move on to the next section, the next section. So it can take a long time to do a full haze up. But it generates a thorough set of tabulated deviations. So what it does at the end of the day, you've got a report where you've considered all possible deviations for this plant. Now, for preparation for a haze up, obviously it depends on the size and the complexity of the plant. That's fair enough. But you might need a lot of data. You need as much up-to-date information as you can possibly get. So you want things like line diagrams, flow sheets, plant layout, operating instructions, they're all there. This is if you're going to do a real one, okay, not the one that we do in the workshop. We've got a few diagrams here, that's sufficient. But you need as much information as well. Even equipment manuals. That shows you the level of where the design is. The design is ready to be built. And it's very important that that is as up to date as possible. If you're doing a HAZOP on information that is out of date, then it's a waste of time because you're doing your HAZOP on the wrong plant. So if you're doing a HAZOP on a plant and then the people who are designing it say, oh, wait a minute, we've changed all this, then you wasted your time because you need to do your HAZOP on the plant that's going to be built. It's very important. So success depends on the accuracy of your drawings, the technical skills of the team. Now expertise is essential. You've got to have people who understand these plants inside out. And I appreciate we're doing an exercise, so some of you, might not have that level of expertise, that's fine. The whole purpose of this part of the module is to just give you a feel for HAZOP. So if you've never done HAZOP before, at least you'll understand what it's about. And also, this is really quite interesting because I always think this is something that engineers are good at. You've got to be able to imagine things. You can use your imagination a little bit when you're thinking of causes and consequences. You can actually use that. But you've got to maintain a sense of proportion. So keep your head thinking of things, using your imagination, but keep your engineering feet firmly on the floor. It's got to be plausible. That's the most important thing. Who carries out HAZOPs? Well, like we said, we've got experienced people, so obviously there's a good chance the design engineers will be involved in it. If it's a chemical plant, process engineer. If it's ready to be built, the commissioning engineer will probably be involved in it. Instrumentation engineers, obviously, there's a lot of instrumentation on the plant. They will be heavily involved with this. I wouldn't worry about chemistry. If it was a brand new plant and it was a new form of chemistry, you might have a chemist involved. The most important person on the team is the independent chairman. And usually the independent chairman is from outside the organisation. Very experienced engineer, knows all about these sort of things, but isn't involved in this actual plant. And the reason for that is that if this lot, when they're doing the HAZOP, come up with a problem, and it turns out to be a really expensive problem, then the tendency is for them to go, we'll pretend that doesn't exist. Whereas if there's an independent chairman there who's overseeing this, that independent chairman hasn't got a financial interest. If they say a hazard, they will say that's a hazard, you've got to fix it. So you can see the reason for that. It's quite a useful facility. We're talking about new plant, but obviously existing plant can be HAZOPed. Existing plant is HAZOPed if it's had any major changes. There's a whole branch of engineering called management of change. And if you've got a plant that's run for 10 years, you've shut it down, you've made major modifications to it, then what all the companies will do now is they'll do a HAZOP on it, just to check that when they made all those changes, they didn't introduce any new hidden hazards into it. So that's quite a useful technique as well. So basically, this is the kind of thing, kind of team that would do a HAZOP where the plant's being renewed. Again, most important person there is the independent chairman. So, yes?
For offshore industry, these are the personnel who handle HAZOP as well?
These are the
personnel you listed.
Yes. Yeah.
Who does the HAZOP in the case of an offshore?
Well, when you see the words like process foreman, plant engineer, whatever the equivalents are offshore. I've never worked offshore, so I don't know
So
what the job titles are. But there would be probably equivalent to that.
actually, it depends on, for example, if manager called the HAZOP investigation, like HAZOP study, yeah? So there will be like manager, OEM, process safety engineers, and other involved parties.
Yeah.
So,
The people who are involved in running the
yeah,
plant on a
independent
day-to-day.
chairman, I think it's for the design, yeah.
Well, the independent chairman might apply as well for both cases because you want an outside overseer.
You cannot call the whole independent chairman all the time in an operation plan. For example,
Yeah, well, yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, that's what's given down for one more upgrade process plant.
because you cannot call the all the time independent chairman. It's, we are usually doing like that. We have process safety engineers.
Yeah.
They are outside guys. I mean, they are not directly hired guys. They're from the contractors.
Mhm.
So we call them, and they will see. They will.
Yeah.
They will do like chairman things, and they will continue with other studies.
That's a good observation. I mean, I don't know how HAZOP's done all over the world, but you know, probably there's subtle differences in the way people do it.
Yeah, but my thinking is the independent chairman is somebody like an auditor who comes in as an auditing firm at the end of maybe a given season. You come up with an independent person in the auditing. Just to open the
Well, it's not normally audited HAZOP. It's the people involved in the team that do the HAZOP. In any group of people, especially engineers, if you get 10 engineers around the table, there are 10 different opinions. You need a chairman to run the meeting, run the agenda,
It's usually process safety.
and stop people from going off on a tangent and stay on course with things. So I mean, normally in any kind of meeting you need somebody in charge, like a chairman. But yeah, I mean, I think you get the picture. But I think in normal practice you might have to do variations on this in practical applications. Right. Okay then. So I've got a couple of examples. One's a bit more involved. I think I'm only going to go through this one. The other one's on the notes. You can have a look at it. We've got a very simple system here. We've got a steam turbine running a generator. And if anybody knows about steam turbines, they'll know that they run very, very fast in white metal bearings. And in order for them to run in white metal bearings, you need a steady supply of lubricating oil. And obviously when you supply the lubricating oil into these very fast bearings, it gets hot. So you have to bring the lube oil out into a lube oil cooler, cool it, and then once it's cooled, put the lube oil back into the turbine. It's fairly simple, isn't it? Turbines could be running at 18,000 RPM, they're very fast, whereas the generator would, you go through a gearbox, that would be down to about 1800 for the generator. So your lube oil cooler is supplied by cooling water supply here, and there's a pump, pumps the cooling water through the lube oil cooler, and everything's happy. Or lube oil is getting circulated through the cooler. It's not too dissimilar to what you've got in a motor car really, but it's a little bit more critical in an industrial situation. So we were going to do a HAZOP on a part of this plant. What I've done is I've drawn a red line around the section I'm interested in. This is fairly typical. In this particular case, I've got the cooling water pump and the lube oil cooler, and I'm going to HAZOP this section. Okay? And my guide word is no, and parameter is flow. So I'm going to apply the deviation no flow to the cooling water. Now, under normal operation, this pump's operating and it supplies cooling water through the lube oil cooler, and the steam turbine gets its nice cool supply of lube oil. But when I apply this deviation, I've got no flow there. So the first step is to think of causes. So can anybody think of the cause for unflow? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? Pump stops, yeah. Is it possible for the pump to stop?
Yeah.
Anybody who's worked with pumps knows, yes, of course it is. Any other causes for
Inlet
unflow?
block.
Inlet block. Well, we're not sure about where this water's coming from, but it could be a river, for example, so it would have a filter.
Straighteners.
and if the filter got blocked, yeah. So we've got 2 cores. I will stop at 2. I mean, there could be more, but it's plausible. It's believable. So the pump could stop, or the water supply could be interrupted for some reason, and this would stop the cooling water from going through the lube oil. What about consequences?
Steam turbine, like raising temperature.
The lube oil would stop being cooled, so the lube oil temperature would rise.
And you will damage steam turbine.
You could, I mean, I think, well, at a basic level, yes, if you're not supplying cooled lube oil to the steam turbine, the bearings would wear out very quickly. And you'd have a big problem with your steam turbine.
So high consequence there.
And if that was to stop, of course, your generator would stop, and then depends what your generator could be supplying electricity to something important. So we've got a consequence. So is that important? Why is it important?
You generate energy somewhere. Save sunlight. Yeah.
Well, the capital cost of the steam turbine are very expensive, I believe. If you damage the steam turbine, I mean, if the white metal bearings went, you could actually shed the blades in the turbine. It could just completely destroy itself. So we've thought of the cause, a couple of causes. We've got a consequence, and it's a serious consequence. I know these seem very logical steps, but you've got to think through them very logically and very methodically. So, and we've got a consequence which is serious. Cause, effect, consequence, serious. So action. What action would we take? We've identified a hazard now, and the hazard is actually to the machinery, so it's cost, basically.
Action.
We probably wouldn't kill anybody, but I'm not 100% sure. We still wouldn't want it to happen.
Stop the turbine. Run a standby one.
Yep, well, let's consider the turbine first. You're quite correct, most turbines would have a low lube oil pressure trip, so if they detect that the oil pressure is too low, which would happen if the oil was hot, it would just trip and stop. You've got no electricity going out the generator, but the turbine has preserved itself. Anything else? Parallel pump, yeah, exactly. Why not have a standby cooling water pump if it's that important? Which gets me to the reason why the pump stopped in the first place. Why did the pump stop?
Supply. Supply. No supply.
No, that was a separate one, no supply, but we said the pump stopped.
Electric.
It broke down. Electric.
Yeah, it broke down. Electrical, mechanical. If it was mechanical, that's fine, you could have a standby pump. If it was electrical, then if the electricity didn't flow to that, it wouldn't flow to the other standby pump, would it? Well, I think what you might do, it depends on the criticality of the situation. I know certain firefighting systems have electrical pumps. Quite common to have an electrical pump. But your standby pump might come from a different distribution board, not the same one. So if there's a problem with that distribution board, or you could have a diesel-powered pump, emergency pump. So if for some reason the electricity supply failed to that pump, then the other pump's powered by its own little diesel generator, diesel engine, which would then...
So you have different
You've
cubicles.
got diversity.
Yeah, you have different cubicles.
Yeah.
Split.
So good, yeah. So that's how you would do it. I mean, just in a very simple, straightforward way, and that's what we'll do during the workshop. And we've just been through this. Started off with, I'll go to the next slide actually, because this is actually a flow diagram of what we've just done. Okay? So we started in the middle with effect, which was no flow. Started here. And we do this first. We think of the cause. Now we thought of a couple of causes. Pump stopped. The water, cooling water, was interrupted. It choked the filter up. And you then ask yourself this question: can it happen? Sounds a bit silly sometimes, but you ask yourself the question: can it happen? And if the answer is yes, you move on to the next one. If the answer is no, go back and think of another cause. So if it's yes, you say, does it cause no flow? Well, pump stopping certainly does cause no flow. So we're here. We've actually completed the first part of this. We then go on to consequences. So we're asking ourselves, what happens? What's going to happen here? And if it's something trivial, like not much at all, you can give up then and go back and think of another cause. But if it's something, so the lube oil overheats, the pressure drops, the turbine stops, and all the various other things, then we've got a consequence. We're there, we've got a consequence. And then we have to say to ourselves, does it matter? Sounds like a trivial question, but does it matter that the turbine overheats and stops? Well, it does. Sometimes you'll get to this stage and you'll say, no, it doesn't. You write that down in your log sheet, your template for the hazards, and continue. But if it does matter, the last question in the list there is, can we do something? And that's where the engineers sit round and they say, well, can we do something about this? And again, it depends on the plant that you're doing the hazard. Because occasionally you will say, no, we can't. That can happen. You say, we can't do anything about this. I don't really know. There's no feasible solution to this. In which case, you've identified a hazard and you can't fix it. So you have to be prepared to go away and redesign your plant if necessary. Fortunately, most of us can sit around and say, yeah, sure, fit a standby pump. That's something we can do in this case. So we've completed. So if you go through that, you're asking yourself the right questions at the right time, and that will take you through it step by step. That's the example I've got there. It's more of a chemical engineering type problem, but you can have a look at that system. It's in the notes, and they're all on Blackboard. And we do basically the same thing again. We've got no flow in a part of the plant, and there's an example log sheet that you can work through. I've actually put some of the solutions in there, so you can have a look at them and make sure you understand the reason why they're occurring the way they are. So, what does hazard benefit? Well, it's really useful during the design or the installation of new plant, or when you've had major modifications, like I've just said. It's useful when there are novel hazards, things that you haven't thought of before, environmental hazards, big on quality or cost issues. If you've had a major incident, if your plant has had a major incident and you've repaired it and you're ready to put it back online, then it's a good idea to carry out a hazard on it, because you don't want that sort of thing to happen again. Sometimes hazards can be used to justify why you're not doing something. So if you've got a particular reason for not following a code of practice or a standard or something like that, then certain legislative powers will allow you to ignore them based on the fact that you've done a full hazard. That will happen. So nothing is perfect, and neither is HAZOP. Even with HAZOP, some accidents still happen. They do happen. Hopefully HAZOP's cut an awful lot of these particular incidents out, of course. But if you HAZOP a plant and then 5 years later there's an incident, people are going to be asking questions, aren't they? They're going to be saying, oh, you were involved in that HAZOP 5 years ago. What did you do wrong? So they will have a look. They will ask you questions. They'll say, did you do the right? Did you go through the right deviations? So it'll be, it'll be scrutinised, and they'll look at what your judgment was at the time. So really, when you're doing a HAZOP, it's in your interest to be as thorough as possible, because if you're not, 5 years down the line, it might come back. So it's extremely important to document all outcomes of the study. That's it. And really what you end up with after a HAZOP is a full investigation of the possible hazards in the plant. Okay, so that takes us up nicely to 12 o'clock. We'll do the workshop in a few weeks' time, and then we'll do the assessments shortly after that. Okay? Did Sue Hill tell you she was coming here at 12 o'clock? She did, okay. Right. I'll give her a shout. I'll go and ask her. I'm sure she told me I would do 11 to 12 and then she'd do 12 to 1.
So we have like storage tanks, three storage tanks. Not so much. One tank. We have regulators, water buckets.
Now tell me the amazing things that you have.
Those is a small one. Like those are the main because we don't do storage. No transport. We don't do storage. We don't do transportation. Like,
Yeah, but it's
so it's simple. How long do you think offshore?
it will be stopped over.
5 years. 5 years? I'm going to do a heads up every 5 years.
It is still 0. I'm about to stop. In which one? But
And then we to elaborate.
It's even more.
yeah, I'll find
Okay, you can give him something nice.
is on transport plates or liquid pipelines. He doesn't have the answer. That's all it is.
I got all the materials. I started with like I have like $500.
Put paper. We got the water disposal one. Just for pulling the plug.
Then it's water pipeline.
No, I know it's specialist.
Are some of you here that weren't here at my last lecture? Or was everybody at the last lecture? Everybody at the last lecture? Yes? Yes, yes, yes. That's okay then. What was John talking to you about just now?
That's all.
Oh God, why did he turn the screen off? What's he been doing? Right, I went through all of these things that you handed in. I was well impressed actually. Thought I don't need to give them a lecture, they can just teach themselves. Anyway, so I brought you all a present. There we are. Well, it's not one each. It's to share. Well, to share between the full packet for each group, okay? There you are. It's not for you to keep. I thought it also might help you Since it's quite near lunchtime, I bet you haven't had your lunch, have you? No. I've had mine, so I'm okay. Make sure the people at the back get one. Do you want to move forward? If I was you, I'd move forward and then you'll get chocolate.
What have you got to do?
Okay. So you'll remember what I asked you to look at was to think about what the potential positive and negative impacts of pipelines would be. And I've been through your list. To be honest, I think I had everything that you had. But if anybody notices something that I'd missed off, you can talk about it. So we've got things like profit and economic growth and employment and infrastructure. Don't forget, pipelines can open up areas because they can bring facilities to areas. You need to pass those along. You can't sit with the whole packet. Oh, okay. So they can, they can bring in energy supply to an area that didn't have it before. They can bring in water and clean water and provide sewage treatment to an area that didn't have it before. And in cases like, say, a big chemical plant, you will need to have chemicals in different parts of the plant, and so it enables you to actually transport these around the site. This is what ICI on Teesside used to do. There used to be masses and masses of pipelines everywhere, and they were taking around things like chemical intermediaries, but also things like compressed air and so on. There's the issue of energy supply, but also the issue of energy security. Do you know what I mean by energy security? Knowing that you're going to be able to have access to energy. A while back, the UK was panicking because we were getting some of our gas from Russia in a pipeline. And they were panicking because the Russians didn't like us, and they were going, well, we're going to cut your gas off. So obviously in some countries this is a bit of a worry. Carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture is quite a trendy topic at the moment. This is where you collect CO2 rather than letting it go to atmosphere and cause problems with greenhouse gases. And you transport it by pipeline somewhere like under the sea, and you put it in a hole in the ground under the sea and you store it there. Have you not heard of this? It's very much what we call end of pipe. You have polluted, you have caused a pollution. You will go and put it over there. It's a bit like, when we have a nuclear power plant and we have nuclear waste, what do? We'll just go and stick it over there, it'll be fine. Well, they're doing the same with carbon dioxide, with carbon, and some people say it's a really bad thing. It doesn't follow the precautionary principle because we don't know what the potential impacts will be in the longer term. And it might be longer term it's fine, but it might be longer term it won't. It'll pop out and it'll acidify the ocean because CO2 is a weak acid, so it'll acidify the ocean. So it's a very contentious issue. But usually pipelines are better than the alternative, which are having tankers, either road tankers or oil tankers at sea. Right, problems. Well, obviously, oil and gas companies are promoting the use of finite resources, i.e. fossil fuel-based carbon products. There's environmental damage to air, to water, to land, and impacts on biodiversity. And there's also damage to amenity. Now, amenity is the value that we put upon something. So, for example, if we think about a lake, what is the amenity value of a lake? What could we use a lake for? Water to drink? What else?
Electricity, power.
if we put a hydro plant, we could maybe put in a pipe. Yeah, that's a good point. What did you say, sir? Sorry?
Fishing.
Fishing, yeah, fishing, yes. Recreation, and it just looks nice, doesn't it? Irrigation, another very good point. So anything that affects the potential value of something is damaging. And it might be you've got, areas which have got significant cultural heritage. I know one of the issues with the Keystone XL pipeline that Donald Trump is pushing for, and all the indigenous Indians there don't want, is they're saying it's going to go through burial grounds where their ancestors have lived for thousands of years, and the companies are saying, oh, it's fine, we'll dig them up and we'll put them somewhere else. Well, it's not really the same, is it? You think it's okay? Well, as far as I'm concerned, if I'm dead, I'm dead. But, you've got indirect impacts on stability and bribery and corruption. Now, Tim Hill, who's one of our visiting lecturers, he's a lawyer. He's going to talk to you about bribery and corruption. There is a lot of it. I don't know if you noticed Rolls-Royce just being done, millions and millions of pounds for bribery. Yeah? BAE Systems, massive fines for bribery. But their argument is that's the way business works. If you want to sell people something, you have to give them a little present. Well, they call it a donation. It's not a bribe, it's a present. It's like me giving you Maltesers. You've just come in at the back. I've been giving them Maltesers because they did a very good job on Monday. Health and safety issues as well. So let's think about the materials choice and the fabrication. So obviously it's using resources, isn't it? No matter whether you're making out of steel or concrete or PVC or whatever. Some people have actually done life cycle assessments trying to decide which is the best. It obviously will depend upon what you're transporting, how long you want to transport it for, and what assumptions you're making about what's going to happen to it at the end of its life. Construction and installation. This is where I have to say my first degree was biology, so this is where I get my biology hat on and say we have to save the world and we have to save all these species. And you can get huge loss of indigenous species. Species that have lived there in the wild for years and years and years, and nobody could get to them because there weren't any roads. All of a sudden you get a pipeline company saying we're going to lay a pipeline, we're going to put in roads, and then all the nasty people go, aha, we can get there now. So we can go in and do illegal logging, we can go in and massacre orangutans and steal their babies and go and sell them as pets and stuff. You've also got areas where animals will traditionally be able to move, say through the forest from one place to another. Then you put in a pipeline so they can't get easily from there to there, or if they can, people can see them, people can go and hunt them and kill them. You've got erosion and sedimentation when you're doing crossings. Obviously, if you've got a pipeline, it's got to go across water. That can cause erosion. You've got impacts on ecosystems and also impacts on people. And sometimes there are still parts of the world where people live, and these people might never have seen other people before. And you go in there and you give them chicken pox, you give them measles, you give them, flu, diseases they've not been exposed to in the past, and it can kill them. There's an example of a massive pipeline in Brazil. And I had a lot of Brazilian students a couple of years ago, and they were telling me about this. So there's an example of Amazon rainforest, pristine, nobody'd been there. All of a sudden, everybody's in there, everybody's going, we can get access to this, we can take out the logs, we can start mining for some sort of minerals that are in there. Installation on land obviously will cause soil erosion, and it will look messy, and if you're crossing rivers, it will cause siltation. The impacts of silt on ecosystems in a river are very bad. I actually did my PhD on impacts of silt on aquatic invertebrates a million years ago. But it will kill them because it smothers them. So they can't get access to oxygen. Same with fish. At sea, you get the same impact. You can, because you're dredging to put your pipeline in, so you will get the seabed being smothered. There'll be increased turbidity in the water. There's more particulates in the water. The fish can't see. The fish can't see to feed. Fish will move out of the area. If you've got little light penetration, then you won't have photosynthesis. And if you've got corals, the corals will be smothered. Therefore, they won't be able to respire, because corals are actually living organisms, and they can die. When we're going through this, if any of you have got examples you want to tell us about of pipelines that you've worked with, tell me.
Yeah, in Caspian Sea we have a pipeline.
And?
So we had like in 2000.
Make sure everybody can hear. Can you hear at the back? No. Yes. You can't.
Caspian Sea, North Caspian Sea, we have a pipeline in.
Yeah.
So in 2013 there was like a failure of pipeline. So it's like we had leakage on pipeline, and the pipeline is actually coming from offshore to onshore plant. So, and Caspian Sea actually, this north side, we have like rare fish. Yeah, maybe you heard about like caviars. It's like
sturgeon.
Yeah,
sturgeon.
Black,
yes.
Black caviars, famous black caviars.
They produce caviar.
Now
yes.
we have, less population of this fish.
Yeah.
We couldn't find them in our rivers. So.
Yeah.
And the problem is like you're saying about this one, yes, silts and disturbing fish.
Yes.
So I'm not considering about this pipeline. So how can it affect to this?
Well,
fish?
it will affect the fish's ability to breathe, because they breathe through their gills.
Yeah. And another question: if you done these researches, what was your action?
I didn't do, that wasn't the topic of my PhD. My PhD was to try to assess which macroinvertebrates, very small insects, which were susceptible to silt and which weren't.
So what was your conclusion, PhD?
My conclusion was that invertebrates that were hairy, that there were very little insects, but if they had a lot of hairs on them, they did a bit better because it protected them. But we're going off topic here.
No, if you have, for example, PhD research, you concluded that we have effects of fish, effects of fish on the other things, so there should be some actions forwards to stop.
Well, it was actually to do with the Brighties mine, and the mine got shut down, so it didn't happen anymore. So at sea, it can have huge impacts, and you end up with marine mammals being affected, and obviously some of these marine mammals are massive, and they're very iconic species. Do you know what I mean by an iconic species? They look nice, we like them, they talk to us, they're sweet. You know, if you were talking about some dead ugly snake or something, you'd go, yeah, it's a snake. But if you're talking about a dolphin, they're just like, well, dolphins are lovely. So it's really bad PR, apart from the fact that it's incredibly sad. Pipelines on land. Sometimes, instead of putting them in the ground so you can't see them, you have to put them above ground, and that will depend upon the terrain, what the geology is like of the area. And if you're talking about it being above ground, obviously it may not look very nice, but also it can cause problems for things like migrating animals. You know, if you're something like a moose or an elk, and all of a sudden you get to a pipeline, you know, how are you going to climb over the top of this pipeline to get to the other side? I don't know, maybe elk can jump. There's also issues over damage, interference by people, theft, and as I said last what day was it? Monday. The project that one of the students I was working with in Nigeria said that 95% of all the damaged pipelines in Nigeria was due to people interfering in. And that is because often the land it's not even owned by the pipeline company. The pipeline company have just decided they're going to stick in a pipeline from there to there, and these people are going, well, this pipeline's going through my land, so I'm going to have a bit of the oil out of it. Fair enough. And then they go at it with a welding torch, and then it blows up. So if reinstatement isn't addressed, it can look awful. It can be a permanent block on the landscape. However, if you do it properly, it can look okay. It's like open cast mining. You know, up where I live, there's been a lot of open cast mining in the past. And actually, the site now looks great because they've planted it, there's trees there, there's more wildlife. They've even put sort of like tourist attractions. I don't know if there's a place called Blagdon where there was an enormous spoil heap, and they've now made it into a work of art, and if you look at it from the ground it looks like an enormous lady that's been carved out. And that's a really good example of good reinstatement of land that's been used for something industrial in the past. The Trans-Alaskan Pipeline System, this is massive. It goes across Alaska, it goes across a lot of mountain ranges, it goes across 800 rivers. So you can imagine the amount of effort that went into building that, but also the potential impacts. And it's in a very pristine area, it's in an area where there's not a lot of people. How are you going to check that's okay? How are you going to check, actually let's go off topic a bit. How are we going to check the integrity of our pipeline anyway? What are you going to do? Are you just going to hope it stays there? Or are you going to pop along and check it?
You have surveillance.
So you're going to do surveillance, yeah? What method are you going to use?
Different methods.
Like?
Air surveys.
So aerial surveys maybe? I did hear of one example in India where there was a lot of unemployment and lots and lots of old people, and they got old people, they gave them a bit of pipeline each, and they went, right, this is your bit of pipeline, every day you're going to walk from there to there, and you're just going to check it. And then they got a younger person with a bike who would whiz along and talk to all the old people and go, check the pipeline, how is it? Isn't that a good idea? Oh, it's a really good idea.
That is visual inspection. But yeah,
Visual inspection,
that's
yes.
its limitation.
Yes, it would have its limitations. But if anything happens in Alaska, it's going to take a long time to respond as well, because it's way out in the middle of nowhere. So you've got 800 miles of pipe, you've got 11 pumping stations. It's very important because it brings in a lot of money to Alaska. And Alaska, whilst it has an awful lot of resources, it doesn't have a fantastic economy. It's important because there's a lot of animals up there, although as you can see, this little moose thing, I don't know if it's a moose or an elk, he's not going to have any problem getting over that because he can just duck underneath it. This is a baby one. It's a baby one, it's got a really great, huge mother. No, probably not. Problems with permafrost. Permafrost is when you're in an area where it's incredibly cold and so the ground is frozen all year round. It is very difficult, therefore, to put in a pipeline because you can't dig, so you've got to put it above ground. And sometimes, because we've got a bit of global warming and we've got temperatures going up, depending upon who you listen to, it's like maybe 1 degree every 10 years. People are worried about what will happen to the integrity of the pipeline if the ground starts to warm up. But there's also issues over what impact will the pipeline have on the ground itself if it's carrying products which are quite warm, and will they cause the ground to warm up. So as I say, the reason why the permafrost melting can be an issue is because it can change the shape of the land. You know, bits of it can sink and the pipeline potentially could collapse. If it thaws, you get carbon being emitted to the atmosphere, which is obviously a greenhouse gas. And this in turn is a positive feedback loop because more carbon means more greenhouse gases, which means the world gets warmer, which means the permafrost melts a little bit more. So it's a loop. In Russia, there is a law that says you can only construct in these areas at certain times of year to protect the ground. I don't know whether that applies in other countries. I would imagine maybe it does. The other thing you can do is you can put in these heat pipes, and the idea of this is that they take the heat from the pipeline and they dissipate it up to atmosphere. But they must be very expensive, mustn't they? Can you imagine? You know, I mean, the pipeline's expensive, and you stick all these in, and these all need making, and these are all going to come from some sort of resource somewhere. Russia's longest oil pipeline goes from Siberia to the Sea of Japan and goes through an area where there are a lot of, again, very important wildlife, particularly this, I think is it the Amur leopard, which is incredibly rare. So, and this, I mean, that's just an excuse for me to put a nice picture of bear. But you need to think about these things, particularly nowadays, because in the past, I suppose you could do stuff that was bad and nobody really knew. Now you've got the internet. Now something happens and somebody posts a picture up and immediately it whizzes around Facebook in 10 minutes and then all of a sudden your company is really in trouble. So what do you do?
Ban the Facebook.
Pardon?
Ban the Facebook.
Yeah, well, I think there are some countries where they don't have Facebook. Here we have an example of in Ecuador. Is anybody from Ecuador? No, I had a student from Ecuador last year. There was this marvellous bird, a type of hummingbird called the black-breasted puffleg. Isn't that a great name for a bird? Anyway, it was endangered because of this pipeline. There was only 250 left. And that isn't a picture of one because nobody's got a picture of one because there probably aren't any left now. So, when we're operating, we will have risks from the operation. Does anyone want to tell me about what happens if you're operating a pipeline? What do you have to do?
Check all the time levels.
So you check it?
The pressures, temperature.
Tell me about compressor stations.
Compressor stations. You check all the time pressures. I mean, there is a maintenance activity.
Yeah.
The compressor station.
And what do the compressors do?
Compress the gas.
Okay.
Raise the compression so it does.
Okay.
And in the process, the temperature as well.
Okay. So you will have releases of all sorts of things from your compressors. You will have generation of oils and solvents. And maybe because you're in the middle of nowhere, you think, well, it doesn't really matter what we do with our waste because nobody's going to notice. So we can just dump it. It's like oil tankers at sea, you know, they sort of think, oh, nobody's going to notice if we clean out our bilge tanks in the middle of the oceans because nobody's watching us. And so they can do things which are illegal. Leaks, spills and explosions. Obviously, can be horrific for the environment, can contaminate the soil, can also cause major, horrible loss of life. And last year, as I said, the student I had gave a lecture on this, and the pictures she shows were dreadful. and I wouldn't show you them because they were too awful. I mean, it was just like barbecued people. It was gross. I know, sorry. But you will also have, depending upon things like what type of oil it is, pollution from oil would depend upon the type of oil it is. So you've got light oils, you've got heavy oils, you've got oils which have got a lot of what we call polyaromatic hydrocarbons in. We've got oils that have got metals in. It can all contaminate the soil, and it can get up into the atmosphere. Here we have an example of the Trans-Alaskan pipeline, and people up there obviously are very bored, so they drink a lot and then they go out, and when they're drunk they go out with a gun and they shoot the pipeline. And that caused a major spill because he shot the pipeline. I know, it's sad. This was a very famous example in southern Nigeria, and the issue here was some people said it wasn't anything to do with the pipeline company themselves. It was due to the fact that local people were trying to break into the pipeline. They used welding torches and they caused an explosion. But suffice to say, terrible things happen. That was one example. That was from 2004. There were loads and loads and loads of other examples. All the time there's examples. Pipeline leaks and spills. The alternative could be road tankers. The other interesting thing that the student looked at last year when he was looking at issues in Nigeria with transporting oil was he looked at the number of tanker accidents. Huge number of tanker accidents. And why does it happen?
Because there's no pipeline. The pipelines are
No, but why do they have so many tanker accidents?
bad roads.
Bad roads.
Drivers.
No, actually, drivers.
No license.
Reckless drivers.
Transport company issues with transport companies.
Yeah.
All the money.
A lot of it is to do with what he was saying, is the drivers trying to work really long hours to make enough money, so they're tired, but also drivers being drunk. All these different reasons.
Overloaded tankers.
Yeah.
No, it's another issue. It's the driving.
So
There is a-
a tanker will be carrying fuel like this, and you see tomatoes on top of the tanker again.
You see-
some other goods.
You see tomatoes on top of it.
Tomatoes, you can see some other goods on top of the tanker.
Really?
Yes. For drivers to make more money, they are transporting oil and other goods on top of it.
Not people. Not people.
Just goods. You know, they make more money.
This was, you've probably heard, well maybe you've heard of the Exxon Valdez oil tanker disaster, have you? This was a tanker called Valdez, owned by Exxon, and it went aground in Alaska quite a lot of years ago now, and it was the worst environmental disaster. Probably until Deepwater Horizon, it was the worst. It wasn't the biggest, but it was the fact it was such a remote area, it took them ages to get there to do anything about it, and also because it's such a remote area, it's a very pristine environment, it's never been touched, it's full of lots and lots of diversity of organisms. This, actually, when this happened, they knew it was leaking, so they tried to contain it by putting a big earth bund around it. Bund collapsed. And in terms of volume, it was greater, much greater than Exxon Valdez, but it didn't really get in the news. Probably because I think with an oil tanker at sea, it's really dramatic, isn't it? Whereas this wasn't so dramatic. It was probably harder to, for the press to go out there. So, an oil executive said, you go there and you are surprised, if not horrified, by what you see. Wells leaking all over the place and big oil spills in marshes. So you say, what am I going to do? Do I mend it, or can I leave it for time to take care of? For an investor, these are big issues. The environmental manager in Nigeria for Shell was one of the people who was concerned about this a few years ago. He made a public statement, he actually resigned, because he felt so bad about what was happening. So, are pipelines always the best means of transport? It will depend upon what you're assuming in terms of, I mean, you can't just compare the transport of a certain amount of fluid from one place to the other, because obviously the pipeline's going to be there for years and years and years. The tankers, you're going to have to build the tanker in the first place. There's lots and lots of different variables. We assume, as we said the other day, we assume our pipeline's going to be there for about 15 years. Some of them will be a lot older than that and may still be being used. Some of them may no longer be used and people have forgotten where they are. Nobody really is going to be bothered about digging them up and taking them away. Transport issues. Again, terminals, as you were talking about the sturgeon in the Caspian Sea, can get issues there. You can get oil spills. Net of net, probably far better to have a pipeline than transport by sea, but obviously there's some places where you just can't transport by sea, and it will also depend upon the integrity of the company who are doing the transportation. That was the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska I was talking to you about. As I say, one of the world's worst environmental disasters. There's been a lot of other ones as well. Interestingly, there was one in Spain a few years ago. What was it called? I forgot. Was it the Sea Empress? Anyway, and it was in a part of Spain where one of my students lived, and her father was a chemical engineering professor at the local university, and he got all his students to get involved in the clean-up of the oil spill, and my students went out and helped, which was really nice. I mean, they sat out, they came back telling terrible stories. So at the end of its life, what do you do? Are you going to leave it there, or are you going to take it away? If you leave it there and it's under the sea, what happens if people go out, try to fish, and they put long nets down and they get caught up? What will you do? You may get leakage. There's no real regulations about what you have to do. Depends which country you're in, and as we said on Monday, even if there are regulations, in some countries nobody cares if you've got regulations, it doesn't matter. So the only things that there's real regulations are for really big fixed drilling structures rather than small installations. So just to finish off with, how are we going to control the pipeline industry? Are we going to use a carrot? Are we going to use a stick? Do you understand what I mean by the difference between a carrot and a stick? What sticks can we use? What's a good example of forcing regulation? What's a good carrot? Pardon?
Tax breaks are actually infrastructure might help the tax breaks.
Yeah. You've also got the issue of public relations. If you say to people, if something goes badly wrong, this is going to indirectly affect you, but it can cause you so much money. You know, the Co-op Bank, the Reverend, have you heard about the Co-op Bank going bankrupt? There was the person in charge, the Reverend Dr. Flowers, who was in charge, who was in the most, I mean, I don't know why he was a reverend, I don't know why he was in charge of a bank. Anyway, he was in the most appalling sex scandal, and it all hit the papers, and the Co-op Bank lost so much money. You do not want to be in a position where your company is in the papers and your share price plummets because of bad PR. So you've got legislation, you've got costs. Cost is a very good driver. You've got taxes, you've got societal pressures, and you've also got voluntary codes and ethical codes of practice, and the fact that you can go out and you can say, we are concerned about people. We are going to make sure that when we send our contractors out to put a pipeline in, we're not going to introduce AIDS and HIV. We're not going to let the contractors go out and be drunk all the time. So legislation varies with countries. Many companies now have a requirement for what we call an environmental impact assessment. You can have a lecture on that. You can have I think it's 2 or 3 hours lecture on that. Environmental impact assessment. Many procedures and processes will also require an environmental permit. An environmental permit tells you what you can and can't do. Here you get an environmental permit from the Environment Agency, and it will say these are your limits on discharges to air, this is what you can and cannot discharge to sewer, this is what you can and cannot discharge to a controlled water, i.e. a river, this is how you should manage your waste, this is what we consider to be the best available technique for how you carry out your process. This is all to do with an environmental permit. You can be prosecuted, and in the past the fines could be fairly small, so people weren't that bothered. Now fines can be massive, absolutely massive. Tim Hill's going to talk to you about how much fines have gone up, but I mean billions of pounds. Also strict liability. Strict liability means if you're the director or you're very high up in the company and something goes wrong, it's no good you saying, well, I didn't know, because you should have known. So you can go to jail and you will lose the ability to be a director. And I'm not talking about special directors' jails with jacuzzis where you all can walk outside and have a nice time. I'm talking about going in with the murderers and the rapists and the drug addicts, and there you are, you were a proper person, you thought you were doing your job properly, you didn't know what was going on in your company, you ended up being liable, particularly if people die. So, EIA. EIA is something we carry out before development starts. The idea of it is it can lead to a better project. By looking at what the potential impacts are and asking people what they think about these impacts, you can say, oh, well, we could have a problem here, could have a problem there. Let's change it a bit to mitigate this problem before it happens. So longer term, it's actually better because it means you're more likely to get the planning permission, you're more likely to have less people opposing it, it'll save you money in the longer term because you can do it quicker, and you have to consider people, the environment, amenity, infrastructure. But you know, you're going to have 3 hours on this, so you don't need me to go on about it now. There's also things about natural habitats. So there's lots and lots of EU directives to do with not hurting wild animals. Obviously, we're talking about the EU. Outside the EU, there may not be regulations. You know, in this country, we have a lot of things on, you know, protecting birds, protecting newt, protecting what do they call, bats. Loads and loads and loads of regulations. There's also more regulations here again. This is to do with offshore, which probably you're not so interested in because it's not to do with pipelines, but there's a lot to do with what you can and can't do offshore to try to protect marine mammals and other things. So what does it mean? It means it is illegal to disturb these animals. You cannot impair their ability to breed, to feed, to behave as they would normally, to migrate, to hibernate, and so on. And if you do, you can be prosecuted. So, it is illegal to hunt, kill, injure, or harass all species of marine mammals. This is a US piece of legislation, virtually the same as the EU example I just gave you. Do you know what that is? Amazing. So, there is the Global Oil and Gas Industry Association for Environment and Social Issues. Have you ever heard of it? Don't you think it's quite sad that they've got such a low profile? Given that the oil and gas industry is very high profile, shouldn't they make more of the fact that they have got this association and they are trying to do something about it? So they have good practice guidance. So for example here there's one on human rights training, fitness to work. There's a lot to do with how you social responsibility and how you look after your own staff, but also how you look after people in an area where you're operating. So have a look at that website. So that is the end of the lecture today. Next time I talk to you, I'm going to talk to you about environmental and social governance risk. Okay? You can go and get your lunch now. Yes. What they think causes it is they think it's to do with them getting damage to their ears, and it affects their ability to navigate. And they think to their inner ear, and they think that the cause of that is when there's sonic booms at sea. You know, when they're excavating for oil and things and they're using sonic booms, they think that is the cause of damage to their ear, and that affects their ability to navigate and migrate. And the problem with them is if one of them is injured, it kind of puts out a distress call, and so all the others come to try and help it, and so instead of one dying, they all die. It's really sad.
It just got to the banks and we were just there.
There was 200 of them killed.
Yeah.
I know. It is awful.
Thank
What you did yesterday?
FIFA.
Yeah, you wanted to me to go and and you never went. I thought you were.
Yesterday I met Ahmed. Yeah, so he said to say hi to me. The bus before and then we came from the store and we saw each other.
She wrote me, my phone is broken now, I'm using my wife's phone. So in my phone there was a messenger. Facebook messenger. She sent me a message, hey, didn't see it. My phone is broken. Why she emphasizes all the time, in UK, here, European Union, we follow everything. But it's true. But it's true. I know. That's why I became angry.